thank you all for coming this evening to our panel on Ukraine, What's Next? That was a title that was meant to encompass all eventualities, and all eventualities have actually evolved or are evolving. My name is Nina Tumarkin. I'm director of the Russian Area Studies program here at Wellesley, and feel it a very important moment in the history of the Russian area studies geopolitical sphere. And as a speaker, Tim Colton, who's chair of the government department at Harvard, I just heard him on a panel this afternoon, said, actually maybe not very elegantly, this is not just a bump in the road of relations of Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and Europe, but really a very major moment. So it's an honor and privilege to have you all here this evening. For those of you who, there are people who maybe will not get seats, and the event is being also streamed videoly in an area in the library right outside, and to alumni all over the world. I've been getting emails from alumni ever since the announcement was made, asking all kinds of questions like, is this going to be Eastern Standard Time or Eastern Daylight Time? But most importantly, how can I get the streaming? And so it's really lovely that alumni are able to hear this presentation. Here we are, March 10th, and it was less than 2 weeks ago that I invited Serkhii Plokhii and Nadiya Kravets, my Harvard colleagues, to come and speak on events that seemed like events that were Ukrainian events that were happening and pretty much constrained in the region of Ukraine. I first reached out the day after a panel at Harvard, exactly 2 weeks earlier, that is to say February, I believe, 24th, on a Monday, when speakers were saying things like, what happens if President of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who is now somewhere in hiding and we don't know where he is, what if he comes to Russia and asks to be taken in Russia? Will the Russians accept him? They were saying things 2 weeks ago like, such as, will Russia, with this new government, clearly Yanukovych, the president, has now been driven out, will Russia stand good and make its promise good to offer $15 billion in aid to a government that's clearly not pro-Russian anymore? We certainly hope Russia will. We think that Russia won't do anything. We think that Russia will lay low and just watch and see how things evolve. Well, events have really taken an enormous turn. I was very, very, very glad to that my invitations to Professor Serkhii Plokhii and Nadiya Kravets were rather quickly accepted. And it wasn't until the day that Russia suddenly appeared in Crimea, or we knew that it was Russia. There were these men in unidentified uniforms appearing in Crimea, that it looked like some kind of Russianist voice should be on the panel. And I decided to insinuate myself as moderator of the panel, even as in the way that Russia insinuated itself into Crimea. I thought that was a kind of nice parallel there. I will not be one of the lecturing speakers, but I will be there in the question and answer period if people would like to pursue other questions having to do with Russian and Russian motivations, although one of our speakers specifically will be addressing it. Before turning to introducing our speakers, I just would like to say how particularly pleased I am that they are the two people who will be coming. They are both Ukrainianists, and a story that's very much a Ukraine story has been hijacked to become a story about Sarah Palin and what she predicted in 2008, and who lost Ukraine, and is it President Obama and Angela Merkel and Putin, and yet we had put together this wonderful panel. I don't know whether you guys we can show that. You've seen our hopeful young people, and my question for our panelists is, what is happening in Ukraine? When you read the Western press, and particularly the American press, so many of the articles are about Washington and Moscow, and the European Union, but particularly about Washington and Moscow. And what really struck me, I'm still old-fashioned enough to read the New York Times in paper, and it's very fascinating to see what kind of cultural politics are going on right now. There were rallies in Ukraine just yesterday. The country celebrated the 200th anniversary of the birth of its greatest poet, Taras Shevchenko. And the New York Times had an article about it, and yet there's a photograph of a statue, which you'd think would be a statue of Shevchenko, but no, it's a statue of Vladimir Lenin. Because the photograph is of an Eastern Ukraine rally where there were nationalists waving Russian flags in front of a statue of Lenin. And I'm so eager to move the story back into Ukraine, into most of Ukraine, which is not the Russian-speaking portion. It has, of course, had so much press right now, and the issues in Crimea have had so much press. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speakers, who I hope will talk about the questions about what happened to the hopes of these young people who you see pictured here, what is going on in Ukraine right now in various parts of Ukraine, and also what about the international situation. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. Serkhii Plokhii is actually back by popular acclaim. When the events first broke, beginning in November, and we decided in Russian area studies that we were going to have some event on Ukraine, I naturally turned to Professor Plokhii, who is, like myself, an historian. He is Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard. He is also the director of Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. And he gave a splendid talk in early December, not having any idea, I think, of what the events that he was describing at that time, explaining how we got to this point with protests in November and in early December. And it was a wonderful, wonderful talk, and it's very unusual. I can't remember in my, very many years at Wellesley. I've been here almost, 40 years, to put a spin on it, I can say that the president, when I first came to Wellesley, was Gerald Ford. So that's quite a while ago, and I don't ever remember bringing back a speaker within 2 or 3 months, the same speaker, for a follow-up. But this is what we all decided that we wanted to do. Professor Plokhii himself was born and raised in Ukraine. He was educated as an undergraduate at the Dnepropetrovsk National University, and he got his doctorate in history from the University at Kiev in 1990. This was already, of course, the Gorbachev period, and before then, he had already been in the United States. He's published many books. A book on the origins of the Slavic nations, pre-modern identities in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And at dinner was just telling me that the next time I teach my medieval Russia course, I actually must assign that, and I will. So you guys who haven't taken medieval Russia history 246, next time around, I think we'll have Professor Plokhi's book, Representations of Ukraine and Russia. A wonderful book on Yalta, the Price of Peace, and a very recent book on the myth of the Cossacks, the Cossack myth, history and nationhood in the age of empires. The Cossacks are getting a rather nasty press at the moment, since we've last seen them on YouTube and on television and the internet, with whips in their hands, beating up members of Pussy Riot. and other, and sort of not the greatest moment, I think, in the image of the Cossacks. And we also have as a speaker Nadiya Kravets, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Professor Plokhii will talk about the domestic side of things more, right? And Dr. Kravets, the international relations side of things. She was educated at San Francisco State. She was actually born and raised in Ukraine, and received an MPhil and a DPhil from the University of Oxford in politics and international relations. Her areas of interest and expertise include theories of international relations, Soviet and post-Soviet foreign policy of the European Union, Ukraine's foreign and security policies, and relations between the former Soviet republics. And she is currently coordinating various collaborative research projects on Black Sea security and a changing global order, on the economy and politics of energy intermediaries in Ukraine, and on the making of Ukraine's foreign policy. So I'm delighted to have both our speakers here, and Professor Serkhii Plokhii is going to be our first speaker, and I hope you'll welcome him very warmly. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor Tumarkin. It's a pleasure to be here. And when it was the first time that I was speaking in front of this audience, it was December the 5th. The next day after that, I was leaving for Ukraine. And I spent there approximately 1 week attending the rallies on Maidan, speaking to professors and students of Kyiv-Mohyla University, the student group that took most active part in the protests in the Maidan. And I was absolutely surprised to see that they would go and take part in the rallies. Some of them would help with preparing food at Maidan during night, and then in the morning they would be back in their classes. I corresponded since then with one of the professors of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and she was, at the time when I was there, she was finishing one of her courses. It was December, and then going to London to do research, and she came back to Ukraine already after this most dramatic and tragic events, when altogether more than 100 people were shot and died. And she said that she was absolutely, I don't know, surprised and moved and didn't know how to react when she found out that 2 of students in her class were wounded. And where they encountered that, where they saw them, she saw them in the library. So they were catching up on the classes that they missed. So that was probably the most moving kind of a personal type of experience, or the closest I was to those events. At the time when I was there, it was a very romantic period of the protests, a very romantic period of Maidan. It was a very festive period. The comments that I heard back here in the United States was, "What is wrong with you Ukrainians? You can't have protest without turning it into a street party." That was more or less mood of December, but again, it was at the time when I was there that a second attempt to disperse the protests was undertaken. What I'll try to do today is to pick up exactly where I left last time in early December, and try to walk you through the streets of Kyiv, walk you through Maidan, and tell about events that were unfolding in Ukraine since late November. There was a number of major players in all these events, and I will try to touch upon and talk about all of them, focusing more or less on the events on the Kyiv's main square. And the players that I am going to talk about would include, of course, the Ukrainian government itself, the Ukrainian business elite, the so-called oligarchs, the Ukrainian opposition, the official opposition in the parliament, and then the people who came to the streets, in a sense associating whatever their agenda was with the opposition and opposition leaders, but also having a vision for Ukraine of its own. And this is one of the reasons why, after the events in Kyiv are over, when the new government came to power, when the old president fled the country, that the tanks are still on the Maidan. The people stay there because they want to be sure that this time around it will not be just the change of the government, that there will be a new attitude, that there will be new people, and that the old patterns, the patterns of corruption against which the Ukrainian society, and especially the younger generation, rebelled, that there would be no return of that. This is the image of new Ukraine. Ukraine that traditionally, especially for us historians, this is a land of Cossacks, the land of Ukrainians, of Orthodox, Catholic, the land of Jews and Jewish shtetl, and the conflicts between Ukrainians and the Jews, Poles and the Jews and the Ukrainians, and then Russians marching in. Well, the name of this name is Mustafa Nayem. And this is the face of new Ukraine in many ways. He is an Afghan. And there is a growing population, Afghan population, and Central Asian population as well in Ukraine. And he is one of the most popular Ukrainian journalists. It was his Facebook post in late November of 2013, of the last year, after the Ukrainian government refused to sign association agreement with European Union, that called people to the street. He got in touch with his friends, with his colleagues, and said, okay, I can't stay at home. Let's get to the main street. Let's get to Maidan. What happened, it was not supposed to happen. Again, that was the age when the leaders were the journalists, the bloggers. Most of the participants were students and younger people in general. In a few days, by November the 30th, the government made an attempt to disperse with force those people, and Maidan entered a new stage when now it would be the parents and the older brothers of those who were on the Maidan first joined the protests, and they acquired still very peaceful, but already much more a different ring to it. One of the most inciting and interesting interpretations of the events at Maidan that I saw were interpretations that go against the general narrative that exists, and for very good reason, in mainstream media. And this is interpretation of Maidan as a clash between East and West within Ukraine, between Russia on the one hand and European Union and United States on the other. And that interpretation says that really what is going in Ukraine and where the split is not so much between Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking population. Those who are more comfortable with Russian culture, Ukrainian culture, but this is a split between still the Lenin land, the Soviet land, and those people, and in particular those regions who want to move forward from the Soviet legacy and leave that Soviet legacy behind. So one of these events of once the radicalization at the Maidan started, again, there would be no yet clashes, there would be no shooting, there would be no blood, but radicalization started with attempts on the part of the protesters to remove the monuments to Lenin, including in downtown Kyiv. And what you see is it's on Khreshchatyk, very close to the epicenter of those events, that the monument, probably the main monument to Lenin in the country, was toppled. And for a while, it seems like kind of out of ordinary move, an act of radicalism. But as things started to develop by January of 2015, altogether more than 70 monuments to Lenin were toppled, mostly in the central and also southern parts of Ukraine. So this is again, it wasn't limited to the center. 3 or 4 of those monuments were also destroyed in the Crimea, the center now of current tensions between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. So what we see here very much is when the participants at the Maidan rose the banner of Europe and European values, that was also an attempt to say goodbye to Lenin and to many things associated with that. So the revolution in that sense on Maidan and in Ukraine was very much a counter-revolution in Lenin's terms. So there was a revolution against the old system, Soviet system. This is when things started to become violent. And you see here a portrait of one of the, again, very popular in Ukraine journalists, Tatiana Chernovil, who was attacked during the Christmas week, so in late December. She was an investigative journalist. And these were the tactics that were used by the government. The police was not shooting at people yet, but there were thugs hired by the government. They had named Titushki after the last name of one of the people who became known in the summer of 2013. So her car was stopped on the highway that was leading between the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and the main airport in Borispil, and she was brutally beaten up and ended up in hospital. Again, that was the case that became the best known in general, but that was an indication of the tactics that would be used by the state, by the government from now on, outside of the law, using not the police, using riot police, but also along with that, using these groups of thugs to go after the activists of Maidan. And what we see now, again, jumping a little bit ahead, what is happening in Crimea now, you see more or less the same pattern with the activists, pro-Ukrainian activists being kidnapped and disappearing. So the latest one came from Sevastopol today, that one of the leaders of the Ukrainian Republican Party, who was very active in Sevastopol, simply disappeared. Things became really violent in January of 2014. What happened in January was that the government passed a number of laws that would allow the authorities to go after people on Maidan. And that was a signal for them that they can't leave. That if they leave, what would follow, what would happen, more or less what happened to Tatiana Chernovil, to the journalist. So they would be arrested, they would be put on trial, so they had nowhere to go. Either they stay there and try to get the goals that they wanted the government to resign, or they will all end, according to those laws, in prison. The government was trying to disperse them once again, and we see by the second half of January, things are going really violent, and you have the first victims, the first dead bodies. Again, some of those bodies are people who were kidnapped, some of them were released, others were beaten up and dropped outside of Kyiv in the woods, and basically because of the temperature, because of their wounds, they wouldn't survive and would die there. But also you see at that time for the first time that there are gunshots and people are dying there. This is the picture of the protesters. Now, again, let me look at this image coming from December, and this is the image of January. This is February. Kyiv on fire. This is Maidan, the main square. When I was there, again, it was very peaceful and festive and so on and so forth. And you see this fires burning more or less at the center of Maidan. What that meant was that the riot police moved to the main street of the Kyiv, to the Khreshchatyk, and at that point they gained control of the half of the Maidan. So, but again, because of the protesters were protecting themselves with fire, basically. They had no other way to do that, and eventually the assault that started in the evening went through the entire night, and the authorities were not able to get what they wanted. So the next 2 days, you see that the police gets live ammunition and starts shooting. This is one of those snipers. So altogether today, we are talking about more than 100 people who died as a result of the events on Maidan. Absolute majority of them are protesters. There are close to 10 people, members of the police, and in particular riot police. What is suspicious about some of those deaths is that they died from the sniper fire as well. And today there is a major controversy in Ukraine. Who are those snipers? Whether they were shooting one way or they were shooting actually at both, at the police and at the protesters, trying to provoke a bloodshed. And again, there would be different interpretations why they would do that, whether to provide an excuse for use of more force to end with Maidan protests, or again, there are arguments that no, that's the opposition who wanted more blood and more attention and so on and so forth. The information that we are getting at this point is that leaves no doubt that all of these groups were groups either of the Interior Ministry or of Security Service of Ukraine, which meaning that it's very unlikely that they would act on behalf of the protesters, and very likely that they were acting on behalf of then government of Ukraine. So these are images already after those events, and the self-defense of the Maidan was divided into hundreds, and now they're talking more and more about the 100 of fighters, the so-called the Nebesna Sotnya, I don't know, heavenly 100. Apparently, they started with 60 or 70. Now they say there is 101 or 102. Let's talk now a little bit about who were those people on Maidan, who died, and that brings us to the question of regional differences in Ukraine, cultural differences, linguistic differences, and so on and so forth, which when you look today at the media, especially in the context of the events in the Crimea, the defense of Russian-speaking population or Russian population in general on the part of Russia, this is something that is up there in the center. So this is the so-called, at that point there were 74 people who were identified. By now it's more than 100. And that's where these people are coming from. So these circles are the members of the police, of the riot police who died in Kyiv. So you'll see that most of the people who died in the ranks of the protesters come from central and western Ukraine. and most of the maybe not most, but particularly the members of the riot police come from central Ukraine and also from east and south. I showed you the map of the monuments to Lenin that were toppled in January. Again, that would be mostly this area, the area of central Ukraine, that was affected by that. It was on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of February that most people died as the result of the sniper fire in Kyiv. And what that led to was basically a revolt and rebellion within the ranks of the ruling party itself. The ruling party in Ukraine was called the Party of Regions. That was for the first time in Ukraine's 20-plus history as an independent state that a bloodshed of that proportion took place. So that was going against whatever tradition of tolerance and political dialogue was established in Ukraine since 1991. The country got independence without one drop of blood spilled, and now 22, 23 years later, there were these victims. The massive deaths among the protesters also made the United States of America and European Union to take a much tougher position regarding the government of President Yanukovych, including declaring that the leading officials in that administration were under sanctions, that they would not be allowed to visit the United States and possibly European Union, that there would be investigations launched into their business operations and their accounts, mostly in Europe. Again, some of them have that in the United States, but mostly in Europe. And what that led to was that the Ukrainian parliament, that was before that, the majority was in support of the government of President Yanukovych, rebelled against him. And the majority voted making use of the riot police and force against the protesters illegal. What that meant, that the government had nothing else to support it but those riot police troops on the streets. Once they were sent back to the barracks, the government collapsed. President Yanukovych fled the capital, and the next day, the Ukrainian parliament elected interim president, who happened at that time to be the head of the parliament. That was the decision that was made in the situation of the crisis. They also declared that on the 21st of May, new presidential elections will take place. And that is the way how it was done is used today, for example, by President Putin and Russian leadership to say that Ukrainian government is illegitimate and talk about the right to intervene into the Ukrainian affairs in defense of Ukrainian constitution. So Professor Tumarkin mentioned that I started as a historian of early modern Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Russia, and that very much reminds me the partitions of Poland and Russian troops of Catherine II marching into Poland to defend democratic freedoms and constitution of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time when Russia itself was, of course, an autocratic regime. What follows after that is the start of the Russian covert operation in the Crimea, and then sending more and more troops without Russian army badges into Crimea. You see here one of those groups Again, the Russian officials called them Crimean self-defense troops. Well, you see that these are highly trained officers. You can compare them to the images that you saw in Kyiv. That's how so-called self-defense troops looked in Kyiv. This is how the self-defense, quote unquote, looks in the Crimea. Now, the commanders take over control of the Crimean parliament. They call in the session of the parliament. It is not clear who attends it, who not. They vote to appoint a new prime minister whose support in the parliament is limited to 3. His party had 3 seats in the parliament and had 4% of the vote. And the process starts that leads to the referendum. So far, there were 3 dates given for the referendum and 2 different kinds of questions. So the first, after the takeover of the government building, the idea was that the referendum would take place on the 25th of May. And the question that would be put for referendum would be whether Crimea wants to become a state and establish its relations with Ukraine on the basis of treaties. Then the referendum date was moved to the 30th of March, and now it will be happening on the 16th of March. And the question is about the joining Russia. That's the main question, not the question of whether they wanted or didn't want more rights and more freedoms and more autonomy within Crimea. So this is again images coming from the Crimea. And the most dramatic events that are happening now is the siege of the Ukrainian military bases there. Ukrainian military are under the orders of not to use arms in order not to provoke the Russian troops or the troops that are considered to be Russian. That's the policy of the new government. So this Ukrainian military pilots are marching toward their base that was actually captured and occupied by the Russian troops. That's the map of Ukraine and map of Crimea with the main military bases there, and that's if there will be confrontation. I hope that it will not happen, but that's where it could happen. Today we heard before I was coming here, I got the news about the first person wounded in the Crimea. So those were the members of the group of people who were coming to the Crimea to provide supplies for the Ukrainian military here, which is besieged. And the person, those were not soldiers, they were civilians. The person who got shot and wounded comes from the city of Zaporizhia here in southern Ukraine. So basically, the division today is not just linguistic, not cultural. This map represents certainly existing reality, but again, it's the language and culture is not as important today in Ukraine as maybe one can get from certainly from the Russian interpretation of that and from some coverage here. I know that we are limited in time. What I tried to do, I tried to provide this kind of a general outline of the start of the protests, and then the outcome of those protests. The protests and the way how I presented them were mostly focused on the 2 major players. So the mobilized people, first younger generation, then people in general, who wanted a better choice for their country, who wanted to move in European direction, who wanted to put end to corruption, and the government. But the government and the protesters on the street is only part of the equation. At the beginning, I mentioned you that there were other very important players. And among those important players were certainly Russia, European Union, and the United States. And what is happening today in the Crimea is linked to the protests in Kiev, linked to the fact that the government was toppled. But it acquired really in the leading role, in the leading position now are outside players. And now it became much more about geopolitics than it was certainly at the beginning. At the beginning, there was this geopolitical component as well, but the agreement around that wasn't signed and that provoked that kind of reaction was not about joining NATO. It was not even about joining European Union. It was about signing association agreement, basically a political and trade agreement with European Union. So it was there, but it wasn't as central. That the protest was about people fed up with the corruption and corrupt government. Now it became really, the geopolitical issue became much more important. And I guess it is more or less here that I will leave the podium for Nadiya Kravets, who will talk, among other things, about geopolitical context and about outside players and what that can mean for the region, what that can mean for the world, and what that can mean for us in the United States. So thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm very glad to know how to pronounce Nadiya's name, which I thought was Nadia, which is the Russian.
Nadiya is fine.
Nadiya.
I'm sure.
And so Dr. Kravets will now take us in a more global reach and continue the story. So warmly welcome, please, Dr. Kravets from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the David Center for Russian and
Just give me a minute. Well, first of all, thank you for coming in this late hour to listen to us talk about politics. That's not practiced at Harvard, I have to tell you that. So, inspiring that you are interested, in fact. Although protests were an internal affair, as Professor Plokhii has mentioned, the way that Moscow perceived what was going on was not about internal affairs. This is an interpretation that we had from the West, and I would count myself in that category as well. The way that Moscow saw about what was going on in Ukraine was about the West. It was about intervening into the affairs of Ukraine. They saw the protests as financed by the American government. Now, whether that was really their belief or this was just an instrumental way of interpreting the story for domestic audience, that is to say, it's quite important in Russian domestic story to create the West as an enemy, in a way, the United States as the other. So creating and recreating that image at home was instrumental. The other interpretation is that this was actually what they believed. They believed that there is no genuine revolution, that the kind that we saw in Ukraine or in the Arab world, that is just done by human beings demanding such things as dignity. So I do believe that it's fundamental in this entire story is to understand that distinction, because it will help us to explain Moscow's justification going forward and engaging in Crimea and potentially moving into the mainland of Ukraine. So I will primarily deal with the role of external actors in Russia here in particular, and I will mention a bit on the role of the West as well. So throughout the protests, as Professor Plokhii has mentioned, those actors existed, those external actors. They weren't the key ones. Russia was playing a much more decisive role. And in my own understanding and analysis of the events, I'd say that it had 4 stages of its engagement. It began with a stage of what I would call an instigator. It is due to Russian pressure, trade pressure, sanctions in summer of 2013, that the Ukrainian government began to think about whether this was worthwhile, this agreement that they wanted to sign, the trade agreement with the EU. And the more sort of Ukrainian government was saying, well, we want that and we would like to sign that, the more these trade sanctions increased. So there's a certain degree of correlation that we can't deny about the behavior of the Russian government and the response that we later received when the agreements weren't signed and Ukraine shifted its orientation once again, or halted its orientation. So that role of an instigator is certainly there. Then it moves into the role of helping the Yanukovych government to manage the protests. And here you can identify three main avenues. The first one was political. So certainly Yanukovych was getting a political backing from the Russian government to suppress the protests. So the language was very much similar when it's used in the media in terms of who these protesters were, why they were on the streets, that these were radicals, that these were terrorists. I mean, the label changed as the events transpired, but nonetheless, the political support was certainly there. The financial support, something that has been mentioned, and I'm sure you probably have heard of, that the Russian government decided to bail the Ukrainian government out by providing it the kind of financing that it needed in order to not default on its loans. But it was also necessary for them to get that financing in order to actually pay various servicemen and potentially pay off these hired thugs in order to contain, if you like, and suppress and control the protesters. So there was that financial support as well. And importantly and crucially, informational support. Something that's not mentioned as much in the Western press, but certainly is a huge factor in Ukrainian politics, is the way in which Ukrainian eastern and southern regions of Ukraine get a very different story from the television about what's going on in Kiev. So if you don't have access to an independent media, especially internet, you would not get a real story for what was happening in Kiev. Why were the protesters on the street? And that has to do with the way in which media is monopolized by the oligarchs, and I can get into that maybe during the Q&A. But it also has to do with the fact that a lot of the southern and eastern Ukrainians, that is to say those that live in those territories, tend to watch a lot of Russian television. So there was a lot of that informational support, or informational war, if you like, that was ongoing within Ukraine. And of course the government and pro-government news media and television media in Ukraine were the ones who were collaborating with that story. So that information was very much what was determining for a while on how people in different regions viewed the events. Which lens were they viewing them from independent media, or did they view them through the regime or Russian-sponsored media, or Russian media? And then we saw sort of the Russia's role again change into becoming, if you want, a veto player. And here I would draw on the agreement of the 21st of February, where supposedly, with the mediation of the diplomats from Western governments, plus a Russian sort of attaché or envoy that was sent to these negotiations, plus the president or ex-president Yanukovych, and the three leaders of the oppositions who signed the agreement that was supposed to somehow regulate the situation, return to a 2004 constitution, which would return Ukraine to a parliamentary presidential republic. And here Russia played a crucial role, in my view and analysis, in basically withdrawing its total political support from Yanukovych. I think at that point it became clear to Putin and to his leadership, or to advisors that are around him, that it's not going to happen. We need to back down, and this is really the way to go, is to give in, have potentially elections, presidential elections a little later, regroup, but Yanukovych did lose some of that support. So they basically withdraw some of that political support that Moscow was giving him. But that agreement didn't hold. that agreement didn't hold precisely because the protesters weren't really included in the negotiations. So the street and the leaders of that civic movement weren't part of those negotiations. And they reacted. For them, that was unacceptable to wait another 9 months potentially with this president that has really blood on their hands. This is how they saw them. And they very much were determined to die for that idea of really removing him from power by all means possible, and further radicalize the movement as well. So that plan that in a way I feel the Russian or Putin had in terms of managing the situation and managing the crisis failed. And he did feel betrayed in that sense, that the new opposition and the way that they came to power didn't hold up to that agreement. And I think he and his advisors did misunderstand the situation, misinterpret it in some way, because they didn't account for this factor, that this was not engineered by the opposition parties, this was not engineered by the Western governments, that this was something that coming from the streets, and really it was those people that were determining the outcome of these political arrangements, if you like. So then we see a slow covert build-up in Crimea, and first political takeover, which Professor Plokhii has detailed, and then an invasion of Crimea, which brings us to a question of why did he do this? This is an absolutely, from a Western point of view, an irrational type of policy choice. For sure, that kind of action would ostracize the Western government. For sure, there will be economic sanctions. For sure, you're breaking international laws that you've been trying to build up. And so, from every analyst that I speak to, both in Ukraine and in Europe and the United States, I guess, all are in agreement, or were in agreement and in shock that this step actually was made. For us, it made no sense. So why Crimea? Why invade it, and why potentially risk everything that you've built up over the last 2 decades in terms of, especially for Putin, over the last decade in terms of wealth, reputation? What is he potentially going to gain from this? And I think from discussions that have been happening over opinion pieces and discussions in platforms like this one, I think the invasion of Crimea for him was a contingency plan. It was plan F or E. It was something that stood there in some dusty chest of drawer, that there was a plan, but it was never to be used. It was something just in case. But what I think this opportunity offered for him is kind of an opportunity of a lifetime, something that has been part of the ongoing ideological discussion within Russia, that Crimea is part of Ukraine, even Ukraine is part of, that Crimea is part of Russia, that even Ukraine does not deserve to be a sovereign state. It was very much part of that discourse. And for them, this was really a chance. So I think the logic went along the lines of, they basically, abandoned us. We don't trust these opposition figures. We have no contacts with them, and indeed they didn't have any contacts with them at the time. That by them I mean that the Russian political leadership didn't really have contacts with the opposition that came to power, that does view the Russian leadership as hostile. So why not go for this plan that can create for us opportunities, both political, military, and economic, that can become either a bargaining card or potentially good resources in its own right. So I will walk down some of those logics, if you like, or motivations that I think take us there. So the first one, that's something that again is quite present in most of the debates about Russian foreign policy, is about the rebuilding of Great Russia. The ideology that Putin has tried to re-engage, if you like, or revive, that really what Russian foreign policy is about is not just the strengthening of the state domestically, but rebuilding of its might regionally and internationally on the global stage. So Crimea, being the part of the imperial Russia and has a lot of these ideological connotations to it, that taking back Crimea would add to that ideological story or myth. The second, more instrumental, if you like, view of the events is political and geopolitical. And that's slightly different, more within the realist tradition, if you like, of understanding and interpreting events. And that is that Russia was losing its sphere of influence, that it was losing the buffer state, which Ukraine was considered for the Russian government, that Ukraine was this buffer security state. And if you know anything about Russian and Soviet foreign policy, they were quite concerned with this building up of these ring of states around them in order to secure, in order to feel more secure. And so by Ukraine going presumably west, and the threat of Ukraine becoming a NATO member potentially, that they needed to do something in order to stop this from happening, potentially even breaking Ukraine apart into two. And so defending the sphere of influence. Part of it is also domestic, because inherently Putin did, as he did with events in 2004, the Orange Revolution, see these protests as threatening to his own regime and his own survival. So it was also about containing the politics of this area that he didn't want to see spread elsewhere. So there was this political dimension in terms of, as I said, much more calculating, and also geopolitical dimension that we can think about. Crucially, invading Crimea would also give him political sway over politics in Kyiv. So if you have this destabilized Crimea or even Ukraine, you now create a table to which, when you're invited, you're a veto player. You create the situation of a crisis which only you can resolve. So this is a very advantageous position to have. Another motivation which hasn't really been dealt with or discussed so much in media, but very much is there, is that there is economic rationale to potentially annexing or even making Crimea independent and pro-Russian. And that has to do with the way in which energy politics of European, but also Caspian energy supplies right here have been sort of, if you like, politicized over the last 2 decades. We've seen the securitization of energy in Europe in general, where it's become much more of a security concern. What does that really mean is that over the last 10 years, Putin has been trying to build pipelines that would make Russia independent and self-sufficient in a sense of delivering its energy resources to markets, to its primary markets, which is Europe. So trying to diversify away from traditional transit through Ukraine, through Belarus and Poland, and instead, which they already done, build the Nord Stream pipeline and build the South Stream pipeline that's supposed to go through the bottom of the Black Sea, not through Ukrainian territory, but through Turkish territory. Of course, for Ukrainians, this was very disadvantageous because it would take away the transit that currently goes on through Ukraine and put it into this new pipeline. But if Crimea is either independent or part of Russia, these territorial waters potentially could become Russian, which would make this pipeline not only cheaper if built, because it can now be moved further up, which is much more shale water, but it could also claim these equatorial waters, where a lot of gas and oil is also in place. And currently there are American oil companies that are exploring in these areas, something that Russians are not very happy about, because not only will this potentially help Ukraine to become energy independent, and Ukraine itself as a state is one of the main consumers of Russian energy. And Ukrainian government under Yanukovych has actually been trying to become much more, to diversify its energy supply, because Russian supplies have been very expensive, even for world markets, very expensive. So by controlling potentially not just Crimea, but my hunch is that they want to control the coastline entirely, is to block off that route, that you would get economic benefits from controlling that trade route. And crucially for energy, as I have highlighted in terms of this pipeline. So there are these economic motivations as well, I think, which again weren't necessarily the main ones, but it's one of those pieces on the puzzle that might have driven the decision by Putin. One last one, which is sort of pretty obvious, but again, there's a debate around it, is about the military and the stationing of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. As most of you now know, both Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet and the Russian Black Sea Fleet are both in Crimea. And Ukrainians have been unhappy for a long time about the terms of these agreements. The fact that even although they control, and there's the bureaucratic procedure that the Russian fleet has to go through when it wants to leave the waters, when it wants to bring more troops in, when it wants to modernize the fleet, that during its war with Georgia, Russia's war with Georgia, these ships and troops were used without Ukraine's permission. That somehow this war was fought with Ukraine participating in it. And this was something that the consecutive Ukrainian governments weren't happy about, that they have no control really over what goes on in the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So from the Russian perspective, they didn't like this constraint that they had to begin with. But potential for this agreement to be renegotiated or even scrapped altogether, I think was very high from the perspective of Putin when he was looking in February, when the agreement fell apart, when the new government comes to place in Kyiv. I think these fears that somehow the new Ukrainian government wants to revise that entire security posture, if you like, I think these fears were in place, unjustifiably so. And then we can talk about why, what kind of calculations were behind his advisors and himself. Why did he overblew, in my view, these security threats that really were coming through with the change of government in Kyiv? And crucially, what the Russian government has been wanting to do is just to stay in Crimea. It's a very comfortable port. It's a much better port than Novorossiysk, for example, which is where they could move the Russian fleet if they wanted to. But it's not a comfortable port. It's not as, the waters are not as deep in terms of the kind of ships that you can bring to the port. So there was a lot of advantages to really staying there, and staying there for good, not having to deal with this every time the new government in Kyiv comes to power. Crucially, they want to increase the number of the ships and what's allowed to be shipped there, primarily to have better control of the Black Sea, potentially having more influence over the Caucasus as well, and having a, if you like, project greater power through the Mediterranean, which would allow them to influence more of the politics of the Middle East as well. And that, if we talk about Syria and bring some of those issues here, then it becomes clear that there's also a military aspect to regaining a larger foot, if you like, in Crimea, where you can determine what kind of ships are there, what kind of ammunition that they have, potentially nuclear ammunition, meaning tactical weapons that could be stationed there, because currently they can't be. So renegotiating that status quo, that military status quo, I think is another motive, potentially. I don't know for sure. I can't penetrate Mr. Putin's mind. But I hope I highlighted to you these several dimensions that are out there that can somehow justify, if you like, not from the position of international law, but certainly from the motivations of the Kremlin. So what's next? And I think we'll have a great Q&A, and I'm looking forward to your questions. But I just want to touch on some of the things as I see them in terms of what's going to happen next. So first of all, just domestically for Ukraine. I am hopeful, and I think the smiling people on the poster were appropriate for that matter. I think that leaving the tents on Maidan, as Professor Plokhii has mentioned, is not because they want to have a party, but because they want to control the way in which the politics evolve as we go forward. And they have created, and the people are creating institutions, civic institutions, NGOs, that want to monitor that process better. And people are very aware of the lessons of the Orange Revolution. So frequently when I talk to my colleagues, they say, well, this is just going to be like another Orange Revolution. It might, but it might also not be the same, just because everybody's so aware of those lessons that they really didn't change the system, that they just changed the faces of the people, and that wasn't sufficient. So what the protesters want now is they want a systemic change of government. Now, how to get there is, of course, a big question, and there's a lot of discussion in and before the Crimean invasion of how to go about it. We talked about lustration, or the removal of officials that known to be corrupt, that known to go after bribes, and so on and so forth. Complete the removal of those from the government posts and banning them forever re-entering that service. There is some of that happening, but not in the kind of scale that potentially one would want. But certainly I see this drive still there. The reason why it stopped, and perhaps is not as front news, if you like, as it should be, is because of the events that have transpired vis-a-vis potential war with Russia. And many of these individuals and organizations are beginning to sort of self-censor themselves and say, okay, we're going to put this on hold and wait until this conflict is over, and then we can restart our program. So at least this is the motivation and logic. We will have a presidential elections on May 25th. From the polls that have been carried out in Kyiv so far, the two likely candidates that will top the charts is Petro Poroshenko, who is quite a wealthy man in Ukraine. One can call him an oligarch. I think he still qualifies as that. He's the candy king, I guess, in Ukraine. He has chocolate factories. And he's been very much a man of the protest. He's viewed as a center politician. He's been in different administrations, if you like. He's good with finances. But more importantly, during the protests, he was right there at the most heated moments of conflict between the regime and the protesters, trying to prevent clashes. So I think he earned this leading role so far, actually, in the polls because of his courage that he's shown in going after, in stopping these clashes, but also finding people that were disappeared, or people that were put in jail. So he would really be very active in protecting and using whatever protection he could and his connections in order to get these people out. So that's where he has gotten a lot of the goodwill, I think, in the ratings that we see. The second, of course, is Ms. Yulia Tymoshenko, probably a figure that is familiar to all of you. She's been released from prison. She's currently in Germany undergoing treatment. And she's what looks like as a second figure, a presidential candidate that, again, is on top of those charts of the recent polls that were conducted, recent surveys that were carried out. So it would be either him or her, we will see. In terms of the kind of policies that both would be pursuing, Tymoshenko traditionally has had a much more statist nationalist political agenda, very similar somewhat to what Putin had in mind in terms of the management of political economy, support of big state enterprises. Poroshenko is more on the liberal side of management of the economy, but I think to an extent they will have a very small room to maneuver given that Ukraine is going to take quite a lot of money from the IMF and from the EU, which all have conditions attached to them in terms of what kind of reforms economically, also politically, but mostly economically, Ukraine would have to undergo. So I think their economic policies will be much more constrained than they would initially would want to. Ukraine is in quite bad financial shape due to the short-term obligations that it has to pay currently, with very bad percent, so to speak, that was attached to them. So it does require this external financing in order to meet those obligations. And so far, things look good. Negotiations are ongoing with the IMF, with the EU. I think they will find the money. The question is under what conditions. And here we have to be, again, very, very careful. I'm currently writing a short piece with a colleague of mine from the EU, from the European Commission, about being very careful about with those adjustment programs, if you like, or with the IMF financing in general. The problem with that is that every time that austerity measures come into place, what usually follows politically is the coming of the right or of the communist or basically the alternative, is that the people can't handle. So what can happen after this austerity measures are introduced is some sort of a return of the former regime. And that's why it's very dangerous to just be thinking in sort of short term when you're think about reforming the economy, which of course needs to be reformed, but you have to be very careful about what kind of political blowback can come from that within the span of a year or two. Parliamentary elections, of course, this is not over. Before the invasion of Crimea, parliamentary elections were discussed. There were 2 bills registered for June or October as a proposal for parliamentary elections. Now these discussions are put on hold, but certainly that needs to happen in order for the cleansing of the government to really take place, and for this government to actually gain the kind of legitimacy, I think, fully, then that people want. There have been positive and negative steps by the current government. Some of the negative steps, which I think all of us have, or those who are observing Ukraine have seen, is return of some of these sketchy individuals that are connected to big money, that were quite corrupt before, and their return to the government in the old new posts. On the other hand, the positive steps that the government has taken is to really look about and start thinking about structural reforms of the economy in terms of signing the association agreement, which will help to normalize processes like state procurement, which is one of the major ways in which corruption in Ukraine happens, for example, which will help to improve the way that people are hired and fired and who is coming into posts and how professional these people are and so on. The reform of the civil service. So there's a lot of reform on the agenda, actually. The question is, would they be able to pull through these reforms under the conditions, under basically a warlike conditions, if events are going to radicalize further, and with potential clashes in Crimea or beyond. So, just briefly before I finish, I think the outbreak at this point of hostilities in Crimea are very high. I would probably bet on 80% of war happening. I don't think it will be a major scale war, but I think there will be clashes. How they will be negotiated and what kind of political settlement, if any, we will yet have to see. What the current position for the Ukrainian government is we're going to try to withstand any kind of military pressure on our soldiers in Ukraine until the referendum of the 16th of March. So they're trying to prevent any hostilities happening before that. And then after this referendum takes place on the 16th of March, they will appeal to the international community, saying basically this is illegal referendum and nobody should be recognizing this. Whether this is a good strategy or bad strategy, I think we'll see after, but this is how the events have transpired so far. So I'll stop here, and we'll open the discussion, I'm sure, shortly.
With the referendum, in the event that the people who are, the Ukrainians who are more identified with Russia, in the event they prevail and they want to form some sort of union with Russia, do you think that that will be a perfect pretext for Putin to come in with troops to protect that area and take control of the coast?
Do you mean in Crimea or?
Crimea
Elsewhere.
and the whole, that southern, that southeastern part of Russia,
Well,
I mean of Ukraine, rather.
if the referendum vote in Crimea would incite a response like this, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Well, the troops are already in Crimea. I don't think that that could become a pretext unless there is an outbreak of some sort of violence or justification for them to move into these eastern parts and southern parts of the country. And that, by and large, will depend on how well the center, that is to say Kyiv, will consolidate and calm down the situation in the regions. So initially we had quite a turbulent protest activity from one camp and the other camp in southern and in eastern parts of Ukraine. Now with the appointment of some of the oligarchs to actually their respective regions in some way, things are beginning to look better for the central government. That is to say, they're able to get control of the police, they're able to control some of these protests, they're going by legal means after some of these very radical protesters that, for example, leaders that were basically calling for secession, or which under Ukrainian law is actually criminal offense. So these are some of the texts that they're using, and I think that's what we need to watch now. To what extent can the center really control the regions? Because if it can't, and if some sort of a situation of civil war can happen, it will be in those parts of Ukraine. And under that pretext, I think then the Russian government can move its troops. Maybe Serkhii has a different interpretation.
Well, I can't agree more that the troops are already there. So this is quite obvious. So the question is of escalation. The question is of the rest of southern and eastern Ukraine. What recent events showed was that the Russian government planned to mobilize the population in the Crimea and in the south in support of the integration of those areas into Russia. They succeeded in the Crimea, but only after they obtained de facto control over the area, military, administrative, and otherwise. So in south and in the east, they're not in the control, and we saw protests and riots on a small scale there, but again, it looks like that they didn't get any further. So again, I agree with what Nadiya said in terms of that we have to be watching what will be happening there. The polls, latest polls show, and again, they're limited in terms of how representative they are, because they're done through the Vkontakte. This is the Russian
Facebook.
The Russian Facebook and on internet, but they show that 85% of people in Ukraine who use this networks, they think that the Ukrainian government should interfere in the Crimea with a quote-unquote anti-terrorist operation. So only 15% are against that. So what that tells me is that at least on the level of the middle class and elites, Russian intervention into the Crimea solidified support for the united Ukraine and for the Ukraine as a state as a whole, which is very important after 2 or 3 months of polarization over the government, over the protests, who supported them, who didn't support them.
Mike is coming your way.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. I had several questions that came up during both of your speeches, and the first one was that I think I wouldn't pronounce your name correctly, so.
Okay.
Professor Plokhii?
Yeah,
Okay.
no one does, so don't worry.
Okay, that's a relief.
Except of Professor Tumarkin, yes.
So you said that the snipers are very likely to not be hired by the current Ukrainian leaders, but in the phone call that has been leaked between the Estonian foreign minister and the foreign minister of the European Union, to me that sounded kind of different, because he actually said that our evidence shows that it wasn't, that they weren't hired by Yanukovych's regime, and also says that it is disturbing that there is no plan to investigate that by the current Ukrainian leadership. So I was wondering if you could say something in reference to that call.
Sure. Well, we had this discussion. I'll open a secret. Before bringing us here, they fed us, so we had dinner before we came here, and we had very interesting discussions with people who were there, and that was one of the questions. What is happening during this telephone call to which you refer is that one of the parties to the call, I don't remember who specifically, cites the information that he or she got from Dr. Olha Bohomolets, one of the leading Ukrainian doctors who was part of the Maidan, who has a quite successful medical business, but actually she was there operating on the people who were shot by the snipers. And after that, Olha Bohomolets said that she never gave to anyone that kind of information, that it wasn't the case. And frankly, I would be surprised even if she would decide that that was the case, given that she was on the side of the protesters, that she would go around and basically talk about that. What we are getting now, it is a conflicting information from the government and from the parliamentarians. So the government officials are now starting to talk that that was a third force, so that was not opposition, it was not the government, that was the third force potentially pointing to Russia that wanted things to flame up. And this interpretation is challenged by some of the members of the Ukrainian parliament, who gave the numbers of the units, the names of the commanders. So those were snipers that were not just hired by the government. They were well-trained units of the secret police and interior ministry. And the explanation that is given is that why they were doing what they were doing, because the government needed excuse to disperse the protesters, and why the current ministers are talking about the third force is because in the situation of the conflict with Russia, they need the military units, the secret police, the army. They have to rely on them. So basically, I don't know, but my interpretation of all of that, those were the government units, and the current government is engaged in cover-up because of whatever military and political challenges they have at this point. Again, this is my interpretation on the basis of information that I have. It's murky situation altogether. Maybe we'll have more reliable information in the future, but again, in terms of the telephone call, the person who is quoted, she vehemently denies ever saying that.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next person, please.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. A couple things. The first thing has to do with the rationales given by the Russian regime for the invasion. It is a state of war already. not a question of whether there will be a war. It is a state of war. And Russian troops have crossed an international boundary into another state. And now they're planning annexation vote. It's a war. So the rationale for the war is that they're protecting ethnic Russians from retaliation, but the evidence that Russians have been actually harassed or otherwise bothered is very weak. So I'd like to ask that question of the second speaker. That's the first question. The second question has to do with external factors and Putin's sizing up of what's going to happen in Europe and the United States. And I think clearly he knows that Obama's not going to do anything and that he really can't do anything. And he also knows that the European Union isn't going to do anything. So, I think it's already a fait accompli. What would you say to that argument? That the annexation will proceed and that it'll stand and that the next best thing to do is to contain Putin from going any further, say, into eastern Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. So that's two major questions, one about war and one about Putin and Obama and so on. So you want to address the war question?
In terms of the motivations for it, I mean, the war, you can call it war. Ukrainians are not yet calling it a war. So at least Ukrainian government isn't. It hasn't become a hot conflict yet. What motivations, what I gave you is the underneath, not what Putin is trying to sell, because clearly, as you've yourself pointed out, that's not really true. We haven't seen any assault on Russian speakers or ethnic Russians in Crimea or anything like that. So clearly there was no reason for him to intervene on these kind of premises or reasons. Moreover, there are plenty of international instruments one can use when a situation of that sort occurs. Responsibility to protect as a legal norm can be invoked in certain situations. This is not one of them. So he could have turned to the UN bodies if this was really a threat. So in terms of the legal position. So what I really tried to just give you was what I think motivates it more from not what he says, but what he thinks, or at least the group around him think. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
There is no threat, really. There's been a discussion, and I think the kind of threat that the Crimean residents felt in terms of the events in Kyiv, they were agitated, primarily also because they weren't getting the information about what was going on in Kyiv, on the Maidan. They did think that there were radicals, terrorists, ultra-Nazis on the streets. If you watch Russian TV or regime television, that's the story you're getting. So of course, if somebody tells you that they actually won and they deposed that president, there was this period of agitation, anxiety, and so on. But then when things started to kind of evolve, I think, and calm down, then the perceptions were sort of different around that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the next question had to do with the response.
Well, I hate to say that, but I agree with what you said. I think that Crimea is de facto under the Russian control. I don't see any circumstances under which Putin would withdraw his troops. In terms of what the U.S. can do today militarily, nothing, and probably it shouldn't try to do that. But what will be happening most likely, and Professor Tumarkin referred to roundtable earlier today, that this is not a bump on the road, that there will be a major reevaluation of the U.S. and Western strategy in general in Europe toward Russia. What exactly, so this is situation de facto. In terms of the situation de jure, we have a number of options there. The outright incorporation into Russia, or creation of another allegedly independent and internationally pariah state like Transnistria, like South Ossetia, like Abkhazia, because it looks like this is the model that Russia is using more and more in the last 10 years, creating these puppet states around its periphery. So either that or a direct incorporation, but that's the only unanswered question in terms of the Russian de facto control. I have no doubt about it.
Right, and as the Russianist on the panel, I'm afraid I agree. I agree also. But it will be fascinating. It's a fascinating moment to see what kinds of new conversations we're going to have in our understanding of the U.S. relationship with Russia, because so far the general tenor has been that we overwhelmingly agree that Russia and the United States want to cooperate on various joint questions of terrorism and security issues in Syria and so on. And now it's going to be a new conversation, and how that's going to evolve. And a very dramatic moment, an odd moment, we don't even have an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador to Russia of all times, because he left during the Olympics to go home to Stanford to be with his sons. So it's going to be a very interesting question to watch. So any more questions for our speakers? So Professor Grody.
I wonder if one or both of you could talk about those people in the Ukraine who feel enthusiastic about the prospect of Russian annexation. How many such people are there, and who are they, and what exactly do they want, if one can speak in such general terms about them?
Enthusiastic about the prospect of Russian annexation. Well, there certainly is, there is that group, but it's a very small group, at least if we go by the polls that have been conducted throughout 2013, which is a regular question that appears in most of Ukraine's sort of polling centers, major polling centers. There was one done in May 2013 by Center Razumkov in Kyiv, and they put a question up generally throughout Ukraine, which you consider to be your homeland. Less than 1% of people answered that Russia was their homeland. So that gives you an understanding of where people's loyalties were. This was done in May 2013. Now, things might have changed by then or by now. And I'm curious to see how the events in Maidan potentially change those allegiances, but that's what we have. In terms of another poll that was conducted by the KIS, which is another center, I'm not going to disambiguate it, that looked at different regions, and where again the question on what kind of relationship do you want to have with Russia, and one of the questions, and one of the answers would have been to be part of Russia. And there, throughout Ukraine, you didn't have more than 30%. No, not more than 30% generally. In Crimea, it was about 40. That was the highest. So again, these are the numbers, I think it's from February, actually, if I remember it correctly.
That's high. I mean, 30-40% are enthusiastic about being part of Russia.
This is, for Crimea, was the highest. And
Right,
we're
but-
talking about eastern oblasts.
It's a lot of people.
So I can give you a number. It's certainly not a majority, but there are these groups. But I think it also depends on how you ask the question, and eventually what kind of effect Maidan had on people's feeling about their geopolitical orientation.
I know that I visited Crimea 2 years ago, and back then people were unhappy with the government in Kyiv for the same reasons that Maidan people were unhappy. Corruption, that was the major issue. And if people at Maidan looked to Europe for a solution of those problems, people in the Crimea with whom I talked, they didn't have any hope that let's say Russia somehow will bring less corruption, but they hoped that the closer ties with Russia would bring back the contracts, would bring back jobs, and so on and so forth. Crimea generally is a very depressed economically area for a number of reasons. One of them is that the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Iron Curtain now created a situation where people from Russia, Ukraine, from the rest of the former Soviet Union can go and take vacations in places like Turkey and Egypt. And for Crimea, where the season is very short, roughly 3 months, maybe 3.5 months, it's basically almost impossible to compete with those areas. The end of the Cold War also led to the situation where the Soviet fleet, Soviet Navy, was split in half, and basically those halves are much smaller than was the fleet before 1991, which meant also less jobs for people there. So they are, their expectations are that either closer ties with Russia or incorporation with Russia will bring Russian money and Russian business. So that's their hope. What will happen, it's very difficult to say, because half of the Crimean budget comes from the central government in Kyiv. 80% of people who come to Crimea for vacation come today from Ukraine, only between 15 and 20% from Russia. Given the money that was invested by the Russian government into Sochi, again, it's difficult to imagine that the Russian government would be very encouraging Russians to go to the Crimea, but also Crimea is not competitive. The prices are high, and the service is lower than in again, Egypt is now in trouble, so we'll see what will happen. But certainly Turkey is there, and Mediterranean is there, and Croatia is there, where a lot of people from the former Soviet Union go to take their vacation. So the economy is a big issue for Crimea. And I guess whatever vote will be there, apart from cultural issues, linguistic issues, and others, will be very much informed by this economic hopes. What will happen? Again, I'm very happy that I am a historian and try to avoid questions about what will
next?
be
Ukraine,
what next.
what next?
What next?
Any more questions? Over here? Thanks, Marlies.
I'd actually like to ask about Timoshenko. So she's a fascinating figure. She is the international icon. She's probably one of the most well-known politicians of Ukraine internationally. And I'd just like to ask, what is the perception of her within Ukraine? Because we have all these very evocative photos of her in the newspaper when she's
With the
just
golden
been
braids
with the
around her
two
head.
blonde braid, like right out with the protesters. But she's also got quite an interesting reputation with Russian oil deals. So I just want to kind of understand, what is she like, not like what is she like, what is her perception as a politician within Ukraine, and how is she going to do in the elections in May?
Well, she is very charismatic, and she does have a lot of that capital, I would say, among the babushkas, the old ladies, and a lot of men who are fascinated by her charisma and her very powerful image that she exuded. But by majority of the people on Maidan, I would argue, she was not an icon for them. She was considered to be, and still is, as part of that old system of corrupt politicians, of oligarchs. She herself is very well financially, basically, because of her past in the 1990s, being one of the major gas traders in Ukraine. So her image today depends on how much, if you like, and how much she will be part of the story vis-a-vis Russia in terms of the current ongoing crisis. But she's certainly not supported by the new generation of Ukrainians that made this protest possible. Again, and it's very interesting to see that in the polls, that Poroshenko, who was probably not really a presidential candidate before, is now really overtaking her in the polls. So I think this is something that is telling about her popularity really decreasing among the younger people, generally among voters. So maybe.
I think we have time for one more question, but I just want to say that on the drive out, we were talking a lot about the extent of corruption among Ukrainian politicians and how people are so upset and so ready to have a whole new system with so much less corruption, and how actually Dr. Kravets is fairly hopeful that such move can come about someday. But we do have time for perhaps one more question. Yes, Professor Shukat. Or maybe two more questions if we have very excited people here.
There's no direct land access from Russia to Crimea. If Crimea should be annexed, or if we have some other sort of Abkhazia-type situation, what would the implications be for Ukraine? Would it be important for Russia to have land access, and how would that be accomplished?
Crimea was part of the Russian Federation before 1954, and it was transferred that year. The explanation was given this was a gift of the brotherly Russian people to a younger brother, Ukraine, in recognition of the 300-year anniversary of reunification of Ukraine and Russia, and a symbol of trust and so on and so forth. Well, that was the way how things were presented. The reality was exactly geography. It was difficult for the Russian Federation in administrative terms to take care of the area that was cut off. So from the point of view of Moscow back then, it made much more sense economically, administratively, and otherwise, so that this area would be managed from Kyiv. Again, at that time, no one believed that those would be different states. So geography was an important part of what happened there. And the Russian government is trying to change this geography. So there are plans for the construction of a major highway and bridge that would connect the Kuban region of Russia through the Kerch Strait to the Crimea. So connecting the peninsula to the mainland through Russia. So that can change really a lot in economy and politics of the Crimea. Unless that happened, really it would be difficult for Russia to do anything in terms of Crimean economy except just give them money. The Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was arrested and kept in prison for a long period of time in Russia, then was released before the Olympics. Today he visited Kyiv. So he made a couple of statements, one of them saying that all this talk about nationalist anti-Semites and others is driving protests is sheer nonsense. And the second one was that Putin doesn't need Crimea by its own because there is no water and energy. He needs Crimea together with southern Ukraine and access to it. So basically, whether this is true or not, again, this claim certainly basically addresses in some way the question that you asked. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, you had a question, actually, sir. Right. I think you were actually eager at the very beginning. So, the last question.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation today. I'm seeing reflections. I want to know your opinion on the relationship, whether it's just resident, coincidental, or symbolic or not, of say the Arab Spring, whereby if you look from Afghanistan to North Africa, what we call the countries today are actually abstract boundaries that were drawn over hundreds, if not thousands, of years of culture, religious, ethnic, whatnot. And as soon as these revolutions have popped off one after another in recent years, once that controlling regime is removed, these generations, many generations of tension or alliance resurface, and the nation-state boundary that was drawn up 100 years ago in the case of North Africa, that almost gets erased in the sense of what the people's needs are on the ground and how they identify themselves and therefore react to their circumstance and how they behave. So can you see, two-pronged question, can you draw any kind of resonance between the Arab Spring and what's happening in Ukraine and maybe other peripheries around Russia? Long question. And secondly, specifically with relationship, say, to Poland, whereby if you go back before Stalin, and for hundreds of years, Poland, Lithuania had a major kingdom in that region of Eastern Europe. And to this day, cities in Western Ukraine today actually have Polish names and a Polish identity that far supersedes modern history. And so I'm wondering what people, say, in Central and Western Ukraine draw from the example of Poland joining European Union and overcoming all the difficulties since World War II in the Soviet occupation.
Thank you. It's so. Which one would like you jump into that? Yeah.
30 seconds or less.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I'll do the first part,
You do
and
the
maybe
Arab
you
Spring,
can.
and you do the Poland,
I'll do
Lithuania.
the comment that you made on tensions and divisions, and I would really advise that you be very wary of the myth created in the Western media and by the Russian as well of these great divisions in Ukraine, and these are the determining factors. Ukraine is divided like any other nation state made in the modern era, where you have many nationalities, ethnicities present in one territorial state. It is true, however, that the Ukrainian government thus far hasn't necessarily managed to create a political structure through which all of these differences would be agreeably amalgamated, created into the kind of melting pot where their interests would be reflected in the political outcome. So not everybody has been necessarily happy about that. And the reason for that hasn't had to do with their differences in terms of language so much or ethnicity, but management and local governance. So some of these reforms are currently being discussed, and I think they will be at some point accomplished if this war is not going to take place or after it, is some sort of a devolution of power from the center towards greater regional entities and local entities to allow people to self-govern themselves. Ukrainians also over the last 23 years have created some sort of a political identity for themselves. So you cannot look at these maps that have been circulating in the media of the East-West divide, or the 4 different macro regions that are shown in Ukraine, or the Ukrainian speaking or Russian speaking. These won't tell you anything about the political motivations of people and how they vote and why they vote the way that they do. The situation is far more complex than that. And it's because of that complexity that, in a way, forces all of these groups to stay within the boundaries of Ukraine. And to, in my view, why a lot of them now want this EU perspective is because it will enable them to deal with the differences of opinion, but also minority questions. I think one of the reasons why, for example, the Crimean Tatars have been supporting Ukraine's independence, but also EU choice, is because they do see greater security of their rights in the application of the norms that govern the European Union. So that just the question of the tensions and divisions, which I think every modern state has, but some do it better than others. And that's what I think the current politics of Maidan were about learning how to deal with those divisions and different past and different interpretation of the past. And it's still in process.
Thanks. I have a really short comment on Poland. Absolutely. The Polish example and Lithuanian example, joining EU, turning economy around, having the level of corruption under control. This is a big inspiration for Western Ukraine, Central Ukraine, but for Ukraine in general. So that is certainly very true.
Well, I think we can even, perhaps very odd for Russia and Eastern Europe, but I think we can end on a hopeful note. Very unusual. And I'd really like to thank our speakers for a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Kravets, Dr. Plokhii. Great job. Great job. Okay, you keep on reading. Keep on reading.
Thanks again. It was a pleasure.